Got it. Now I'm getting nervous as recording is in progress. It's 2:30. I opened this afternoon session. For some other people, it's morning or late at night. But for most of you, I guess it's a good afternoon that I can wish. We have a keynote speaker to open this conference day, who's Gejnevall. He will introduce himself in a bit, but just a few spoilers. He graduated from Linköping University. He had a master degree also in engineering, software engineering from UC Santa Barbara. He joined as an enterprise architect, Capgemini and Combitech. He founded his own business and worked as a consultant and still does. And for quite some years, he has been active in different standardization activities with the Open Group. While I have an easy time to understand standardization and enterprise architecture, I have a harder time to get my head around enterprise architecture and in our agile world. So therefore, I'm most curious to get your take on this topic, and the stage is yours.
All right, thanks, Welf. Let's see if I can get this working. So I've been working in the IT/enterprise architecture business for quite a long time, and I've been working with lots of different types of organizations across the world, or not so much across the world, mainly in Sweden, but in Denmark and actually lived in New Zealand for a while and did quite a bit of work there. And as Welf mentioned, I studied in the US as well. So Open Group has been something that's sort of been something that I've been working with the last 15 to 20 years. Open Group does mainly enterprise architecture standards these days. And for quite a while, I've been working as a chair of the SOA working group there. And we actually published a couple of papers that became ISO standards after a while. One on SOA governance and one on SOA reference architecture and so on. I've been also working lots on meta modeling stuff. So architecture is, in my view, a lot about modeling, and then I've been chairing the group within the Open Group that actually creates the TOGAF meta model, and I also work with the Archimate meta model in the Open Group. Lately, I've been co-chairing the Agile Architecture work group, and we're still working on new documents and new stuff coming out of that right now. I live in Växjö in Sweden, and I'm semi-retired since 5 years back. That's some background of me. Enterprise. I thought we'll talk about enterprise architecture and how it can be used in an agile world. But we just want to give you some kind of definition of enterprise architecture to start with, and I'll use the very simple version of enterprise architecture first. So usually, as an enterprise architect, you look at a current situation, and some kind of future or to-be situation, and you look to see what's the gap between these two, and then you actually create a roadmap to fill that gap, a high-level roadmap, and what could the current situation be, and what could the target situation be? About 20 years ago, Telia, which is the largest company, the telecom company in Sweden, they had a situation where they were very product oriented. That was their current situation, and the target situation was that they wanted to be customer oriented, and then you needed to define sort of what did they mean by being customer oriented? And also document and understand their current situation, and then find out what kind of changes did they need to do in their organization, in their processes, in the IT landscape, and make a roadmap of that, and then put a price tag on it, and define a number of projects that needed to be run to make them more customer oriented. So that's an example of a very high level architecture. Then you can, and it's also, when we talk about enterprise architecture, the word enterprise seems to mean the whole organization. It doesn't have to. The TOGAF definition of enterprise is actually very variable. You can be quite small. It could be a group within an organization, could be a business unit, could be an even smaller thing within an organization that you need to do some change in. And you can work on enterprise architecture on that. And enterprise architecture, in my view, is more a mindset. And you can apply it really to lots of different situations. If I look at it more in a little bit more larger context, a lot of times the CXOs of a business, they have meetings and they plan for the future, and they look at the business goals and technical possibilities and come up with business strategies and IT strategies. And the CXOs sit there and they decide, yeah, we're going to change a lot of stuff. So we're going to run a lot of change products. And they decide, yeah, we'll run this and this and this and this project. But usually it fails to reach the goals they set up, because all these different change projects have lots of relationships to each other, and it's not really understood what those relationships is. There's something missing in between the strategies and the actual change project, and it is the enterprise architecture, as I see it. And enterprise architecture can be seen as business architecture, which could be processes, information, organization, people, places. And the IT architecture could be the applications, the data, the technology. And all of this need to be understood, and all the aspects of this and the relationships between all these different these building blocks needs to be understood. And usually you have a current situation, as I said before, and you have some kind of target in the future. And out of this falls a number of change projects. But now we have control over these change projects. We know how they related to each other. We can tell the context. We can make the people running this project understand the context of this project, instead of just being told to do this, and that you can give them a much better context. And a lot of times you might want to buy a product that's needed in this, and you can go out and tell the supplier of that and have them understand the context, the bigger context, because that's often lost in things. I worked in another Telia project. It was actually it was about 20 years ago sometime, and they were building 2 really large systems, and then they've forgotten one piece. When you have a phone number came out of the one system, and it was needed in the next system, but they had never connected it to the systems. So people had to sit and type in the phone number in the second system every time. And it was quite interesting that they spent many hundreds of millions on this, and it was never architected. It was just built and from requirements, but they didn't have the full context how it was supposed to be used. So that's really enterprise architecture in one way. And if you look at enterprise architecture, we talk about architectures quite a lot. Everywhere you hear the term architecture. And this conference is called the software architecture. It's called the software architecture conference. There's lots of different architectures out there. For a while ago, I realized that a lot of people were called architects not because they were doing architecture, but because they were getting paid more. And of course that's nice, but and if you look at in ads for resources and for people these days, a lot of times they have the enterprise architecture in the title, but when you read about what the whole thing is about, it's some quite a lot lower level. They wanted some IT manager or something like that, or some chief technical officer or something like that. Enterprise architecture has gotten a bit of a stamp of itself being enterprise IT architecture, but the real, in my view anyway, the real enterprise architecture is when you look at the entire the entire organization or entire piece you're interested in, the problem you try to solve, or the challenge or the opportunity you try to solve. Look at it from all aspects, from the business perspective and from the IT perspective, and from all other regulational types of aspects as well. But enterprise architecture sort of got relationships to something that we these days call strategic business architecture. You look at the value streams, the value chains, the capabilities of the organization that's needed. Those things you sometimes they're done within the enterprise architecture grouping, or sometimes they're done outside, or sometimes they're done in collaboration. And then we have the operational business architecture, which is more how you set the strategy in operation, which would be, you know, what would the organization look like? What would what roles are there? What are the processes? What information is moving around within the business? It's not the data; it's the information that's moving around. But what are the more important information concepts you discuss, and so on? And that part is more closely interwoven with enterprise architecture. Most enterprise architects do quite a bit of that. The area where they don't get involved so much is business process reengineering, which BPR was very popular like 10 years ago. You don't hear the term anymore, but enterprise architects shouldn't be going down into the low levels of business process work. And then you have like product solution architectures, because not everything that the enterprise architect does needs to be something that's used internally. It could be the architecture of a product or a solution you sell. And that's also a possibility, and enterprise architects should be involved in that as well. And of course, it's software architecture, what you guys been discussing these days. And it's both part of the enterprise architecture, because enterprise architects needs software architecture skills. And one of the reasons why enterprise architecture and architects have been seen as more IT people is that they've usually been recruited as the expert software architects, or in an organization that they look at it as a career step to go into a high level of abstraction and working with enterprise architecture. But they were also skilled in software architecture then. So they had this dual role, enterprise architect and software architect, and usually there was more fires in the software architecture part than in the enterprise architecture part. So they get sort of dragged back into the software all the time. And then we have But now, and in the past, enterprise architecture has always been like people have seen enterprise architecture as something you do enterprise architecture first, as I said, and a bunch of projects are created from that. But the world has changed, and enterprise architecture sometimes have a problem with the delivery time of how much of enterprise architecture do you need to do. And when you go into the agile world, this is sort of a high level view of what an agile world will be like, things will change, have changed this way and today, and it is changing continuously, which is a good thing. Enterprises are starting to become much more agile in all their aspects. DevOps is something that everyone talks about these days, and DevSecOps and industrial DevOps is becoming more popular. The CI/CD, continuous integration, deployment, delivery, and some of these frameworks for doing this. So, but what is an agile enterprise really? This is one definition that I've seen that I kind of like. Is a fast-moving, flexible, but also robust enterprise. And the robustness is very important. I mean, you could be fast-moving and flexible, and then if it's not robust, you probably fall into pieces quite quickly. And you need to be able to do rapid response to not just problems, not just challenges, but also to events and opportunities. So you need to be able to respond quickly to those. And you want to be able to achieve continuous competitive advantage. And the last piece is serving its customer. The customer orientation of an agile organization is the key, really. So that's one of the pieces of puzzle in the agile world. Then you have sort of these agile development methods, DevOps, where you combine. I don't think I need to explain to you what that means. DevSecOps has been showing up lately, where you actually have to throw in much more security thinking into your entire agile development, and of course that also reflects back into the enterprise architecture. With my current customer, I work actually in a group of IT architects and security architects, and we build quite complicated products, but they need to for the Swedish military, and the sort of the size. We usually say that our products are like a space station, but more complicated. So you need to do quite a lot of architecture in those, but you also need to look at security, and everything around security is important. And often the enterprise architects and the security guys can come up with quite good stuff, but you need to have the developers, the detailed developers, understand security and understand how to include it and how to code in a secure way. Industrial DevOps is something that's been showing up lately, where you actually are trying to deliver cyber-physical systems in a DevOps way as well. One of the companies, Swedish companies, Saab, a couple of years ago, they won a prize for their development of the engine for a fighter jet in an agile way. So they did it in piece by piece. So it doesn't have to be software that you build piece by piece and put them together in something bigger, and you can show pieces. Not everything fits in that way. It's pretty hard to to build the hull of a submarine in piece by piece and sink it into the water. It won't make the IT systems feel very well. And then you have continuous integration and deployment, which is sort of other terms, agile things. These are things you run into all the time. And you have the agile framework like Scrum and Safety. These are and I think people are more and more moving to the Safety world because it's more commercial. Scrum is more a freeware kind of thing, while Safety is something you have to pay for. And but both these frameworks, both of these frameworks look at an iterative way of developing whatever you do. Safety is much more software oriented. Scrum has been adapted by organizations and are used in many other in other things than software development, but usually not that well defined. People like to use the word sprint and Scrum and so on, but in the end, it's basically just renamed their sub-project for sprints or something like that. So it is not quite there yet, and to be successful in agile methods, you actually need to follow much more of these things. People say that if you don't use basically all of Scrum, then you're not going to get all the benefits of it. I don't know if Safe is saying something similar to that, like that, but Dean Leffingwell, who is the author or the creator of Safe, it was quite interesting. I went to another presentation or a discussion set with Grady Booch a couple of weeks ago, and Grady Booch said that Leffingwell was his boss at Rational when they worked together there, which is quite interesting. So it's interesting to see the history of the guys that actually came up with these things. So Safety, Leffingwell worked for Rational with the Requisite Pro, which is a requirements management tool. And then he went off and consulted some, and then he created Safety. So it's interesting to see the background of these guys sometimes. The same goes for there's some other agile frameworks out there, like the Discipline Agile and less. And Discipline Agile is the child of Scott Ambler, who used to work for IBM. And it's been sold. The whole framework was sold to Project Management Institute, and it's sort of died out after that because there's no updates to it. So, how does enterprise architecture fit into all of these? Enterprise architecture used to be, as I said before, something you did first and set up the whole big picture, and then that's what's supposed to be implemented in an agile way. And the biggest flaws you have is you do the big design up front, and it might take you 6 months to a year to do that. And then you start implementing these things, and you kick off 10 different projects, and it's probably many millions of dollars or euros or crowns in doing this. And the world changes during this time, and so we need to be quicker in doing the enterprise architecture. Right now, it's often delivered late, and it's usually abstract. It's not very usable. people talk about people sitting up, and they're in the architect sitting up, and they're in the ivory towers, and then throwing the architectures over the fence to the development teams, and not really explaining them that well. And as we say, they become too abstract. And enterprise architecture have a tendency to become very compliance focused. You're supposed to comply with this architecture, not explaining well enough to the development teams what the focus should be like. More sort of, here's the document, go ahead and do it. Because I think that the enterprise architects need to work together with the development teams much more. So they need to collaborate, and also collaborate even more with business and maybe the end customers as well, to become more agile, to understand the end user. It could be in the user of the stakeholder of the problem that you're trying to solve might be one stakeholder away. It could be external to the organization, but a lot of times you get stuck within your organization and not really talking to the real end users, the end customers. So what does the Agile world think about architecture? It is a lot about making important decisions. If you listen to people like I mentioned Grady Booch before, he was talking about this in this seminar I participated in. It was about the important decisions that needs to be made, and also to make these decisions when needed. A lot of time, if you do your architecture, all of it up front, then it's much more likely that those decisions will change as the project family portfolio grows, and you might not do the correct decision if it's done sort of 6 months or a year before it's going to be used. So trying to postpone the decisions to when they're needed, to do just-in-time architecture is something that the Agile world likes much better. But to make important decisions and to make decisions when they're needed, we need, how do you know what important decisions you need to make? Is that you do it because you have experience, or how do you know when those decisions are needed? You probably need to do some level of architecture quite early to identify these important decisions and identify when the decisions are needed. You maybe don't need to do them right now, but you need to identify which ones they are and when they will be needed. Open Group published a paper called the Agile Enterprise Framework, and which is these were the things they were saying. Don't always agree with them on that, but one is you can look at them and say, yeah, how is the enterprise segmented, and the allocated of functions and activity to segment, interfaces, guardrails, standards to be used, and risks. These are some of the decisions that needs to be made. You don't know all the decisions before, and unless you're doing exactly the same thing you've done before, you might understand. So some decisions are there for every project, and of course those can be dealt with easily, but the ones you don't know you need to make is the hard ones, and that's usually why projects get late or fail. So what can Agile EA learn from Agile? We can learn to deliver results faster. Instead of having to wait 6 months to a year, we can deliver pieces of the partitions of the architecture that we know that these are the areas we should start with. These are the areas where you can get a business value quicker. You look at outside in instead of inside out. That's what I meant before by being much more customer oriented than we've been in the past. Just-in-time architecture and collaborating with all stakeholders. And the Agile world come up with lots of new interesting workshop methods. And I think that a lot of those are needed to be able to collaborate, find new ways to collaborate with your stakeholders. I think that's a lot of things that can be very useful from these methods. Design thinking, system thinking. Design thinking has brought up a bunch of interesting workshop methods. And there's a whole bunch of other things as well. We won't go into the details of them now. So what role would EA have then in this Agile world? And when we need to become Agile with creating the enterprise architecture as such. But right now, quite often, I mean, you get told, we want an architecture for this, and you set off and you do it, and you have a little discussions with your stakeholders in the beginning, and then you deliver something in the end. I'll show you some patterns that we've looked at for how that can happen. And the same thing will go, we need to find ways of collaborating with Agile solution teams, the enterprise architecture team and the Agile team, and to collaborate with the Agile business. And one thing that's been discussed quite a bit lately is, especially in the US and Department of Defense, is they want to be able to buy their software, their solutions, and quite often a lot of software, but the whole industrial DevOps kind of thing, how you can buy something in an Agile way and still not get lose a lot of money on it, but that's a lot of trust comes into that. We'll have a little bit of discussion on that later on. We'll discuss the emergent and intentional architecture areas. Minimal viable is a common concept used in the Agile world, and how can we use that? And the project versus product area is another one that the Agile world brings with them into this, and when enterprise architecture needs to deal with. So an Agile EA production would be quite of course it will be sprints or increments or whatever you want to call these different things. Probably for any enterprise architecture endeavor, you need to create some kind of vision in sprint 0. And then, of course, you will review that and do retrospective how you created that, and do the planning for the next sprint. And then you do a part of that vision in the first sprint, and you review it in retrospectives, do retrospectives on the work and the planning for the next one, and it just goes on this way. And of course, at the end here somewhere, you deliver your enterprise architecture. But that just means that the enterprise architecture process has become more agile. And of course, in each one of these, the stakeholders will participate in the demo or a review of it, whatever you want to call it. I mean, we can demo our models of the vision. We can demo the enterprise architecture. But the important thing is to have a conversation here, maybe every second week or third week or 4 week, whatever size of these sprints or increments you want to do. You collaborate with your stakeholders and look at, see what this is as far as we gotten. What do you think? Are we going in the right way? Instead of having to wait for that for the entire thing is completed. And of course, retrospective, did we do our work in a good way? Can we improve that in any way? And of course, planning for the next one. So this is very simple way of doing it and have an EA team. This could actually be one person or one enterprise architecture. It could be a team of 3, 4, 5 enterprise architects working together. But then of course, an improvement of this would be that you do your Agile Enterprise architecture as we saw in the picture before, but in each sprint there will be one or more teams doing Agile development, and they would use, if you look at this one for instance, it will use the enterprise architecture that was created in sprint 1, and it will start developing according to that one, and it's just sort of going this way. And of course, these two teams will talk to each other, discuss with each other, because the enterprise architecture that comes out of here, they need to collaborate to understand. So it will be information going both ways. The enterprise architecture will explain what they meant, and the Agile development teams will explain what they learned and bring that up to the enterprise architects, and it will influence the next sprint, the output for the next sprint, and so on. So this is one way, one pattern that could be used. The same goes for if you have Agile business development teams, because in an Agile business, they have Agile business development teams, and they want to work in a similar way, and we work together with those teams in the same way as I mentioned before. And of course, then you can bring it all together. And here you do have a good starting point for an Agile enterprise. But this is only some patterns. Some other people think that creating, instead of having division between the Agile business development teams and the enterprise architecture team and the solution development teams, you have people from all those different teams in each one of these sprint teams, and you develop it this way instead, which is an alternative way. And of course, sometimes depends on the size of things, of course, and it might be needed to have some kind of oversight or above this, but these are ideas on how this can be done, and some of it has been tried and pretty successful, but it's very different from organization to organization how well it works. Agile acquisition is another thing that I mentioned before. What is it about? Yes, a buyer wants to buy a solution from a seller that is not that clearly defined at the starting point. You have, and in some cases even come to the point where the seller really, what a seller sells is, I have 20 different Agile teams or one Agile team, and they will work in 3-week sprints, and each sprint will cost you X amount of euros. That's what the seller is selling to the buyer, and the buyer, of course, then collaborate with the seller to actually define what are the sellers going to be building, and that means there's a lot of trust needed in these situations. One way to create that trust would be to have enterprise architects from the buyer and enterprise architects from the seller actually collaborating and making sure there is a common understanding between these two of all the different aspects of the solution or the system or whatever you want to call it needs to create. And I think that it's a potential win for both sides. The buyer will get what he wants, and the seller will then have a chance of influencing the high level of thinking of this. But there are some flaws in this as well. I was in a project a while ago where I was on the selling team, and we decided, we said in our contract with the buyer, your architects will have to approve our architecture. And we sold it for a fixed price, and after a couple of months, the architects with the buyer was saying, no, we don't like your architecture. We want to do it this way instead. We want you to do it this way instead. And then since it was a fixed price contract, there was a big fight, of course, and the lawyers came in and so on. But in the end, we made a pool and said, yeah, you're right, we'll do it your way. And of course, we started doing it their way. And another 2 months down the line, they discovered, the architects of the buyer discovered that, the buyer discovered that, yeah, you were right, we were wrong, your original architecture was right. But so it's important that you have a collaboration. But an interesting thing is here, the financial agreements between the seller and the buyer. This was a fixed price contract, so it wasn't a good idea to allow that to happen. But if what the buyer is buying is just manpower in a sense, then he can change the architecture if he wants to, and of course he has to pay for it. There's no one else going to do that. But I think that the collaboration between the EA teams in both sides, because then the buyer doesn't have to have a whole bunch of lower level or solution development people. It's enough for the buyer to have some knowledgeable enterprise architects, and then the seller needs to have a similar level of competence as well. Emergent and intentional architecture is words that people in the Agile world are throwing around, and I just thought I'll mention it. Intentional architecture it's architectures that actually you do some kind of architecture first. How much? That's always the big question. How much architecture do you need to do intentionally? And I think it depends on what kind of architecture it is. If you're going to build something that is irreversible, I think it's more important to do a lot of work up front. I mean, if you build a system and after you started implementing it and you started changing things in the organization, you can't reverse it back. You need to think much more in those cases. So you have to, but anything can be reversed, of course, to some with a larger cost associated with it. So it's a matter of thinking hard about this, and also about the decisions that we talked about before. If you do an emergent architecture, you make the decisions when they're needed in the context of that product you're doing. And of course they can be right, but if it's only in the context of that product, not in the context of other things that's happening within your organization, you might be creating stuff that was already created somewhere else in the organization and you didn't know about it. Or you might be doing the wrong decisions here because you don't have the full understanding of everything. But it's a trade-off between these two. And of course, it comes into the just-in-time architecture, which is probably something in between these things. Make enough architecture for the important things. Minimum viable is another interesting concept that's been thrown around. It's interesting that it's been around since 2001, I think. It was first defined then, but then Eric Rice and Steve Blank adapted it in 2008 when they wrote their book about innovative organizations. But it started off by a minimal viable product. So what is a minimal viable product? What is enough in a product that you can actually show to your customer and start using by your customer? And the definition of that is quite it's very different. And I looked at some research around it, and it's not always that successful. But I think it's important to think about it anyway and see what's the minimum thing I can create to make some customer happy. A minimum viable architecture. It's hard to find a really good definition of that in the Agile world, and I see again the architectures that we create in the patterns we looked at before. The minimal viable architecture would be something enough for a one or more sprint teams to actually start developing something. And the same goes for minimal viable development. You can do something minimal viable there as well. You can find some pieces of the business development bigger thing you wanted. You can find some small partitions or pieces of that and start doing the architecture for that. And that architecture is then used to define the product and the development of the product can start. But of course, product development doesn't always have to be software development. Let's say you create a minimal viable product. You can create one which is basically just a bunch of process changes and no IT changes at all. So agile solution development doesn't have to be agile software development. It could be agile process development as well. Marketing is another one where you see minimal viable being mentioned as well. I won't go into that one. And I think that we do have one last thing that is discussed quite a lot, and which is the product versus project. In the beginning, I really struggled with this a bit, but after a while, I realized that these are really the biggest changes between the project and the product. A project has a beginning and an end in time. When it's done, then the team moves on. But and of course, when it's done, it's usually being moved into maintenance. But a lot of times that maintenance will not happen in years from now, and you deliver the whole thing in one go. In a more product-oriented world, you have a stable team over time, and you focus on providing incremental benefits. So slowly you increase the functionality of the product you are creating, and the team stays with it until the product is dead in a sense. But most likely, most likely some of the team will be replaced over time, as it would be over here as well, depending on the length of time. If this is a product that's going to stay alive, like say Windows, it's and you want to do Windows in a stable team over time, it's probably many hundred people involved. But it has got a stable team, and that's the whole idea around this. Instead of having, we're going to do this release and this release and this release and this release. This is providing small incremental change, beneficial change over time. So, as a summary, enterprise architecture and Agile are complementary. They need each other. But every organization will do this differently and in their time. You can see, and some people start working on the Agile Enterprise, try to move up there, and some people want to move create almost every organization starts in the software development side of things, but then they move maybe to more industrial DevOps as well, and then they move up and create more and more architectures and become agile in creating the architecture. Frameworks like SAFe are actually moving up in the abstraction levels and including more and more enterprise architecture in SAFe. It's included in SAFe, and of course, Open Group and TOGAF are working on creating and changing TOGAF to become more agile. It is actually agile as it is. It's just that it's not very well understood, but also TOGAF is moving slightly down as well, and taking a bigger portion of solution architecture as well. But it won't happen overnight. So I got 8 minutes left for any questions.
Thank you, Mats. Are there any questions? Well, I have a few, and maybe I can start with the first one that crossed my mind here. And that is, in Agile software development, you have usually a definition of done of a task, and you can do testing, and then you say, okay, I'm done with that feature, and then I deploy it to production or to the product. I have a harder time seeing something similar, a test before something becomes real in the Agile Enterprise development or enterprise architecture development. Do you have some means of checking whether a transition is complete, or is that not necessary because it's so trivial to see? Or how do you make sure that the rest of the organization functions after you have done a sprint in Agile Enterprise architecture?
I agree with it's not. Depends on. You say testing. What you really want is how do you ensure that it's got high quality what you deliver?
Yeah.
And testing is one way of getting high quality.
Whatever you know of done.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And if you look at software testing, not every piece of software you can test. You can't test everything. Some non-functional requirements are sometimes hard, but you probably and some requirements might be hard as well testing, because you probably go ahead, and I've seen that happening where people actually read the code to ensure that that this requirement is being fulfilled, and they need to read the code because it's very hard to test it. And then I mean, like every exception that happens in a piece of code, you can't test because it's very hard. But you put the exceptions there because you might maybe hit that place, but it might not even be possible to hit that exception.
Fair enough. But what do you do as architect? So I have my tools in order to manage quality of software anyway. They may or may not work completely, but what do you do then on your side?
Well, we rely a lot on reviewing, and that's usually the biggest one. And having and walkthroughs is another way, where you actually walk through the architecture and the flows of things. So you have different stakeholders sitting around the table, and you have a scenario you put forward, and they can play different roles in that, and you pass on information between the different stakeholders in the scenario, and that could be a way of simulating. Of course, there's a lot of talk these days about simulating stuff as well, and we're going there, but it's not quite there yet. It gets very expensive to model the architecture in a way that it can be simulated, because it needs to be exact. Otherwise, it's hard to simulate, and architecture is not always that exact, because that's the problem with some of these modeling tools you see these days. If you want to draw a relationship between two elements, you have to draw an arrow between them, and it's between these two. But sometimes you want, in your enterprise architecture model, you want to say it goes that direction, not exactly that way, and because you need to create understanding, not exactness. And if you wanted exactness, I mean, when you looked at the old model-driven architecture thing, then it really never took off. Because it got too complicated to draw the models. If you wanted to, I mean, the UML 2.0 kind of thing, where you're supposed to model your architecture in that, and then you generate the code from that. But it got too complicated. It got more complicated actually to create the models than actually writing the code. So I think that's why you never hear anything about it these days. At least I don't hear anything about it these days. So it is about reviewing things, and of course, walkthroughs I think is the one I like the best, really.
We are almost back at Marian's question from before about abstraction, aren't we, Marian?
Yeah. How do you test abstractions? How do you validate or quality control your abstractions? It is not easy. But again, it's validated partly by development teams, and that's why if you do the architecture in sprints, in small increments, and people are implementing those, you get that feedback quicker than in the past, when it took you a year to do an enterprise architecture and then 5 years to do the development. Now you do it maybe over 5 years, but the architecture is evolved over those 5 years. And of course, it changes as well. The problem with the 1 year version is that the business is moving so quickly these days, so you can't do something in. If you leave it for 1 year, the world has changed in the meantime. I worked in a really large European, the CESAR project, which is European Air Traffic Management for Europe, which was a I think it's up to 10 billion euros kind of project now, and it started. Let's say if we wanted to create the high level architecture of that, it will take you 3 years, and then you do the next level of architecture. It takes you another 3 years, and then the world changed, and you have to start on from scratch again. So what they actually did was they started the high level, the medium level, and the low level architecture at the same time, and you coordinate
Mm.
between the teams continuously, and then you did some testing as well at the low-level stuff. So you got the testing back. So then we have to have these 20 airplanes, and they need to fly in these ways to test this. So it was pretty expensive to do the testing. But it is.
We have one more questions maybe, because we run out of time. Sorry, Mats, that I have to interrupt you.
No problem.
More questions. I think if I understood correctly the schedule, we should have, yes, okay, we should have a short break. So thank you, Mats, once again for
thank you, Mats.
High-level view on architecture. I wish everybody a pleasant coffee break, and then we resume in a few minutes, 15:40 after the break, with the session that Xavier is sharing. And I hand over to you, Xavier.
Thanks, everyone.